Welcome to Physiology of the Sarcomere. Starting at low ventricular volume and short sarcomere length, as sarcomere length steadily increases, so does the degree of actin-myosin overlap, with a predictable incremental increase in the number of cross-linkages and subsequent increased force of ventricular contraction in systole. So, there is a predictable relationship between initial length of the sarcomere and the force it can generate during a subsequent systole, and this is shown in the diagram for a range of sarcomere lengths. It is important to recognize that the sliding filament mechanism at varying sarcomere lengths provides a very elegant explanation for Starling's law of the heart, describing increasing stroke volume with increased ventricular filling, which is the ascending limb of the Starling curve, and then decreasing stroke volumes with excessive filling, which is the descending limb of the Starling curve. As impressive as this is, there is more. It is important to recognize an aspect of sarcomere function which is frequently neglected: their role during diastole. During a normal diastole, as the ventricle fills, the potential energy stored as the pressure of the venous blood enters the ventricle is converted to stretch of the sarcomeres. The increase in volume is from approximately 30 mils to 100 mils of ventricular volume. The potential energy from the venous blood is stored in the increasing overlap of the sliding filaments of the sarcomere in diastole, that is, increasing stretch of the ventricular myocytes. Just like a stretched rubber band, this mechanical energy is stored for subsequent release in systole, like the same rubber band snapping back to its original length. If venous filling pressures are high, the degree of stretch may be damaging, even dangerous to the sarcomere, and it will make new actin-myosin cross-linkages to prevent further stretch. Again, a bit like two pieces of Velcro sticking together. So the increasing hydrostatic pressure of the volume of blood entering the ventricle in diastole is incrementally opposed by increasing diastolic wall tension. And when the pressure of the blood in the ventricular cavity is exactly equal and opposite to the tension within the ventricular wall, diastolic filling will cease. And this, of course, is an application of Newton's third law of equal and opposite forces. I just referred to tension in the wall of the ventricle. The tension in the ventricular wall in diastole is referred to as preload. This term is frequently misunderstood and misused. Preload refers to a tension in the ventricular wall between 2 points. It is not a volume of blood in the ventricle. Note that the manufacture of cross-linkages in diastole to prevent excessive ventricular stretch is metabolically demanding of both oxygen and substrate. Therefore, diastole is not a passive phase, it is a metabolically demanding phase, and limited oxygen delivery in diastole is one cause of ventricular diastolic dysfunction. But more of this in a later video presentation on ventricular diastolic function. Similarly, afterload is simply the tension in the wall of the ventricle during systole. In health, small diastolic filling volumes generate only modest force of contraction, as is appropriate to pumping a small stroke volume. And as diastolic filling volumes increase, increased actin-myosin overlap generates increasing force of contraction, producing an appropriate increase in stroke volume on the very next systole. Note: an implication of this is that it acts to maintain reasonable constancy of end systolic volume. In effect, the degree of ventricular filling in diastole determines the degree of cross-linkage overlap required for subsequent systole. It's a very elegant mechanism. The actin-myosin mechanism is a great example of the body's physiological economy. Expressed another way, much of the energy consumed to prevent excessive stretch due to increased diastolic filling is not dissipated in diastole, but is stored in the energy of the actin and myosin cross-linkages. The energy stored in these cross-linkages is then suddenly released with an enhanced force of contraction at the onset of the subsequent systole. This phenomenon occurs in each and every normal cardiac cycle. In the last 10% of diastole, atrial contraction augments ventricular filling, stretching the sarcomeres significantly, again with this energy being stored within the sarcomere. During the very next systole, that energy stored in the ventricle, which is basically energy from atrial contraction, is released from the sarcomere as a more forceful ventricular contraction, generating an increased stroke volume. On a technical note, it is important to point out that increased ventricular filling leading to increased ejection of blood is due to an increase in actin-myosin cross-linkages. This increases the force of ventricular contraction, but without any increase in contractility. This is not a mechanism that increases contractility. This increases force of contraction. Increases in contractility do, of course, increase myocardial metabolic demands very significantly. Note that the increased force of contraction and contractility are not synonymous. We have no good measure of contractility, but is more closely related to velocity of sarcomere shortening than to the force of sarcomere contraction. Based on the number of actin-myosin cross-linkages, which is closely related to sarcomere length, this functions all at a constant degree of contractility. Just because force of contraction is increasing does not mean contractility is increasing. In summary, the potential energy due to the pressure of venous blood and the energy of atrial contraction are not dissipated during ventricular filling. The sliding filament mechanism described by Huxley allows this energy to be stored and released in the very next systole due to an increase in actin-myosin cross-linkages, and the stored potential energy is translated into kinetic energy of blood in the ejection phase of systole. This represents an incredibly elegant and sophistication in the physiological economy of the heart. As stated above, the actin-myosin cross-linkage mechanism elegantly explains Starling's law, but the fact that it can also explain the consequences of dangerous overfilling of the ventricle in diastole is quite amazing. It is hard not to be massively impressed by the simultaneous simplicity and sophistication of the sarcomere. This is a superb example of form dictating function, and it provides a beautiful explanation for increased filling pressures increasing stroke volume, with excessive filling pressures decreasing stroke volume. You will need this knowledge to understand the section on ventricular performance, and you'll also need this to understand management of hypovolemia, heart failure, and even separation from cardiopulmonary bypass. Once again, in medicine in general, and in intensive care medicine and anesthesiology in particular, knowledge is power. To understand the mechanical performance of the atrial and ventricular myocytes, we must review the relationship between the myosin and actin in a sarcomere. The sarcomere is all the actin-myosin filaments between adjacent Z discs, as shown in this diagram. When the sarcomere contracts, the Z to Z distance decreases, and this occurs by the mobile filaments of actin sliding past the immobile filaments of myosin. In this diagram, there is only a modest area of overlap between actin and myosin, which will give rise to a small available area for the formation of cross-linkages. During a sustained muscle contraction, the actin filaments slide towards the center of the sarcomere, increasing the area available for cross-linkage, which increases the total number of crosslinks formed. When crosslinks form, the ratchet mechanism drags the Z discs on the actin molecules closer together, and the sarcomere shortens. Here we see the position for maximum actin and myosin overlap, and this represents the maximum shortening for the sarcomere. Work must be performed in diastole to unlock this ratchet mechanism to allow the sarcomere to return to its original length. Now in this diagram, we see a single sarcomere represented by a single ventricular myocyte. Recall that one ventricular myocyte will contain many hundreds of thousands of sarcomeres. The ventricular myocytes can be thought of as containing contractile elements, actin and myosin, but in a muscle cell, there is also connective tissue with elastic properties. In this diagram, the contractile elements and the elastic elements are shown in series. The ventricular myocyte is attached to a load, which in systole is afterload, and in diastole is preload. Now, The next diagram shows the very same myocyte attached to its load, and the overall length of this myocyte is constant. But from top to bottom in this diagram, we see shortening contractile elements with lengthening of the elastic element, and so no change in overall length of the sarcomere. This represents what happens in the isometric phase of contraction. The ventricular myocyte is performing intense work, but there is no change in the position of the load. That is, we do not witness any external work, but the work done and the energy used in this phase is much greater than it is in the isotonic phase. The next diagram represents that point in which the elastic component will stretch no more, and further shortening of the contractile element leads to shortening of the entire length of the myocyte, and external work is seen to be done, as the forces generated by the sarcomere moves its point of application. This represents the isotonic phase of contraction for the ventricular myocytes. So, a little high school physics. In these diagrams, the load has mass and inertia, and the contractile unit acts on this load to move it and overcome the inertia, and this implies giving it an acceleration. The force generated is the product of the mass times acceleration, and the work done is represented by how much the force moves its point of application, that is, the displacement or distance of the load is moved from its original position. This little bit of simple physics helps basic understanding, and should you need to calculate cardiac work, which is the product of the change in pressure and the change in volume of the ventricle during a single cardiac cycle, delta P times delta V. The derivation of this can be done with relatively simple physics. Now this diagram shows the increase in pressure with increasing volume in the left ventricle in diastole, and if the volume of the ventricle is increasing, the length of the muscle fibers must also be increasing. As the volume of the left ventricle increases in diastole, so does the tension in the wall of the ventricle, and we often refer to this tension as preload. The tension developed in the cardiac muscle cell in systole is maximal if it commences at normal resting length, that is, its length in diastole. If the initial length in diastole is less or more than resting length, the developed tension is significantly less, as shown in this diagram. The maximum tension developed in systole is additive to the initial tension existing in the resting muscle fiber in diastole, and when we superimpose the systolic tension curve on the diastolic tension curve at various initial ventricular myocyte lengths, we get this curve, and this means that when ventricular myocytes are stretched in diastole, the total tension generated in the subsequent systole is significantly increased. So if the ventricle fills more, it ejects more, and this is the mechanical basis for the ascending limb of the Starling curve. This image describes the performance of ventricular myocytes at the start of systole in the isometric phase, with the generation of exponentially increasing force at a constant muscle fiber length. Now in this image, we see the transition of the isotonic phase, where the muscle fiber shortens dramatically and load on the fiber remains constant. In this diagram, we see that for systole, as afterload increases, the degree of maximal shortening of the ventricular myocyte decreases, but this degree of shortening is higher at high initial preloads and lower at low initial preloads. In other words, a high preload in diastole enhances the performance of a ventricular myocyte in the subsequent systole. And if we look at velocity of shortening, we see that a similar relationship persists with varying afterloads and preloads. And again, these properties reflect how ideally suited cardiac muscle is to the operation of Starling's law. These images demonstrate that ventricular muscle fiber work and power increases at low normal afterload levels, but decreases dramatically at abnormally high afterload levels. And as you might expect, the work done and the power exerted increases with increasingly high levels of preload in the preceding diastole. Here, we see a diagram of the sliding filaments of actin and myosin at varying levels of overlap, with the two extremes being very short sarcomere lengths, characterized by decreased potential for cross-linkages, and very long sarcomere lengths with minimal overlap and dramatically reduced ability to make significant cross-linkages. Each of these positions has a maximum tension which can be developed. Moving from the very short to the longer sarcomere length, we see the development of increasing tension from excessively short length to increased tension at a longer length a plateau of constant tension within a range of ideal sarcomere lengths, then decreased developed tension at excessive sarcomere lengths. Now, let us take a leap from sarcomere length on the microscopic scale to stretch of ventricular myocytes and ventricular volumes on the macroscopic scale. In this diagram, we see sarcomere length and the degree of actin-myosin overlap correlated to ventricular volume and position on the Starling's curve. When dealing with clinical issues of ventricular performance, such as heart failure, it is always important to bear in mind that the ultimate determinant of maximum stroke volume and cardiac output will be the amount of actin and myosin overlap and the potential for cross-linkage formation in the contractile elements of the sarcomere. This is an extremely elegant example of how a thorough understanding of our basic science informs and improves our ability to manage clinical problems, particularly the problems of ventricular performance in conditions like hypovolemia and heart failure. Thank you for watching.